Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's ISMM webinar. I'm Dave Millichap, ISMM Corporate Account Director. Many thanks for your attendance on this sunny morning. The format of today's webinar will be a 40-minute presentation followed by 10 minutes for questions. So if you do have any questions, please use the chat function and I will make sure our presenter Richard will get those questions at the end of the 40 minutes. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker for today, Richard Barkey. Richard is CEO for Imparter Limited, and Imparter are one of the leading sales training organisations globally and a valued ISMM corporate partner who worked with us for many years now. Richard's going to talk to us around the subject of sales training and innovative approaches for the millennial generation, a subject that I know is high on the agenda at the moment. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Richard, who will take it from here. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Dave, and good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. So as Dave said, the topic for this morning is sales training with a particular focus on innovation in sales training and the way that applies to the millennial generation. Now, innovation is a very interesting topic to talk about because when you start looking at the kinds of things that are out there these days in sales training and training in general, there's a massive range of techniques and capabilities available, from apps to adaptive training to real plays, gamification. So in one sense, everything I'm going to talk about is probably on this slide, but I was hoping to try and put a little bit more structure around it as we go through the next 40 minutes. So the first question that really struck me was, why is it that we want to innovate? And I think innovation is critical, but it's important to know what the motivation is behind that. And as in many things in life, there are kind of 2 or 3 main areas that one is trying to affect through innovation. The first is efficiency, whether that's the cost of training, and clearly in a market, an industry environment where demand may be subject to some shocks over the coming weeks, that could be an increasing factor, but also time, and time is one of the commodities that's in short supply these days as well. So improving the speed of learning and the kind of return on time invested is also critical. And then you have the effectiveness side, the effectiveness of the learning approach, the level of engagement you can achieve with the learner, and especially with millennials. And I think it's also worth saying the occasions in which you can get the training to happen. So moving out of the classroom into the workplace has been a trend over the last 20 years really, but I think that trend is accelerating. So those are some of the motivations. If we turn to look at what I mean by millennials, and some of you will know a lot about millennials, others may not have thought about it quite as much, but there's a great thing called the Beloit Mindset List, which is a college in the US that gathers information on the joining class, and they have a list of kind of 30 or 40 attributes of the people who joined that year. So I've got a few of them I've pulled out here with a few of my own thoughts. The people in the millennial generation have always known of Google. Google has always been there for them as the way to access the world's information, as Google put it themselves. They've never licked a stamp in their lives because they were always sticky. For them, writing letters is pretty much something that they've very rarely done. Email is a formal form of communication. Most millennials would much rather use something like WhatsApp or other forms of chat to communicate than an email. Email feels very stuffy. Wi-Fi isn't something new, it's an entitlement. It's not something that they even really expect to pay for. It's something that you just have. When a woman is the first woman to do something, that's no surprise for a millennial. It may be exciting for their parents, but it's no big deal for millennials. Brexit clearly has to be a factor, given that the vast majority of millennials voted to stay in, and I think that will shape the emotions and the mindset of many millennials, and I think the desire for the ability to move around within an organization, and especially to other countries, will probably go up, not down, over time. And then the final thing I wanted to add here is, millennials see training and learning and development not as something that's done to them, but as a perk of the job. That's part of their decision process when they're looking at different places to work. So this topic of sales training, particularly when we're looking at millennials coming into that function, I think goes beyond indeed making the organisation effective and towards making it an attractive place to work as well. So those are millennials. There are some characteristics. I have 8 characteristics of millennials here that I wanted just to touch on very quickly, and what the implications are, I believe, for how we train them. So the first characteristic is that millennials embrace novelty. They're interested in novelty for its own sake. So on the left there you can see the HTC Vive virtual reality headset, and I'll come back to VR in a minute actually. But if you've got a bunch of people who embrace novelty, one of the things you can make sure you do in training is vary the learning styles within the training. So, most workshops have a lot of stuff that goes, I'll kind of introduce a topic, we'll talk about it, we'll do an exercise, we'll do a debrief, and that generally won't engage many millennials if it's repeated over and over. You need to vary the style as far more than one would even normally have to do. The second characteristic is that millennials are desperate for clarity and context. So, if you're not explaining why the training is happening, how it fits into the broader sales strategy for the organization, that's going to be an issue for most salespeople, but especially so for millennials. So we need to explain the context of the training and how they'll be evaluated so that they know what the goalpost is. The other thing is that clarity is also around the structure of any information or methodology that's being posted to them or presented to them. And in any training, in any communication really, signposting that structure is critical, but especially so with millennials. Providing hooks that they can hang their ideas and their recollections on is very important. Millennials visualize. They are massive and rapid consumers of visual information, so it's incumbent on us to limit the use of large amounts of text or even audio, and generally to favor visual media. The one statistic I've heard is that millennials switch their input stream, in other words, move from one source of information to another 3 times a minute on average. So you can expect people talk about short attention span, but it's also about kind of being voracious consumers of media, and typically visual stuff will kind of have more traction than other forms. Millennials tech up. So it's critical that when we are training, we use integrated technology for instruction, because otherwise it will feel out of place and outdated and again won't gain traction. It's also relevant for the content of the sales training. So selling in a digital world is very, very different, of course, from selling, frankly, even 10 years ago. And the use of social media for selling, for gathering information, one's own brand online, all of these things are big issues that need to be covered in the methodologies, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. So the second 4, millennials are above all free birds. They are relatively disloyal, not in a bad way, but they just don't necessarily see that as a key value, and that's to organizations, but it's also to topics. So if you are training millennials in how to sell, it's important to provide wider content as well. So they'll also be interested in the next stage of their career. They'll be interested in interpersonal skills and so on. So try not to keep things too focused on a single topic. Allow self-guided input and self-guided learning, and make it a dialogue so that millennials like to contribute as well as to be in receive mode. Out with the plans. Millennials tend not to be too worried about structure and plans. They're more spontaneous, and we need to reflect that in our training, so supporting flexibility and spontaneity in the way that people learn, so just-in-time learning, building it into CRM, mobile apps and so on are obviously very key there. Generation coach. So millennials are very, very strong consumers of coaching, and they want it pretty much anywhere. It's not just sit down and have a formal discussion, it's coaching on the go. So it's important that we build coaching into the learning experience, and of course, and I think everybody understands the importance of coaching and making training stick, but providing it on the job as well. And then finally, millennials are very much about play, and whether that's Clash of Clans or Minecraft or indeed play in their social life, that kind of interaction is really critical and really important and actually quite addictive. And so it's important that we include elements of gamification, but more than that, that we engage people in experiences both in real life, for those of you who are not millennials, that's what IRL means, and in virtual reality as well. So that's kind of a high-level view of some of the things that we need to consider in training millennials in sales. I wanted to try and put a bit more structure around the innovation that will meet those demands. And so the diagram you can see in front of you begins at the center with the content, which I'm going to talk about first. Then the learning design that suits millennials, and indeed the innovation that's going on in sales learning design generally. And then around the outside, I've borrowed one of Imparter's frameworks here, which is the capability building system, as we call it, which is our way of expressing the change process that you need to wrap around training to make it stick. So it begins with connecting with the people in the organization who are to go through a change, engaging them in the process to happen, and beginning a dialogue. The develop stage is the training itself, stick is how you make it stick, and then measure is obviously kind of the way that you bind all that together and make sure that the impact is real and known. So I'm going to use that framework as we go through the rest of the presentation, just to kind of structure my thoughts and to gather a few more ideas together on innovation that's going on both within Imparter and generally within the sales training industry. Let's begin then with content. And I said earlier that millennials like to have stuff around the edges. So here is our view of a very simplified core sales training curriculum, and you can add and subtract things to this. But the key thing is there are multiple levels here. So at the base level, you have kind of the foundation selling skills, interpersonal skills, rapport building, questioning technique, those kinds of things. The next level up is kind of core sales technique, whether it's opportunity management on the left, creating client value as our opportunity management program, or account management on the right. And then you've got the extended layer of skills, negotiation, commercial acumen, you could argue a case for business acumen being in there as well, selling to the C-suite, etc., etc. And then at the top level you have the management layer, sales coaching and sales management, and indeed there's actually there on top of that, which is sales leadership. So those are kind of some of the functional skills that people may want to have access to, may need, but going beyond need, they may want to. So, while you might define a role footprint for a new starter that says, I only need a few of these, there may well be value in millennials in giving them access on an elective basis to other content. But beyond that, and this is something we found very much in Cisco, where we've been engaged in their global virtual sales organization, doing a great big kind of induction program for their millennial salespeople joining, is that there's kind of a triple helix of how-tos that when you bind them together become very, very compelling. So there's the functional how-to stuff, but there's also the kind of company and the job how-to. So, where do I go to find stuff? How do I navigate our internal IT systems? Where do I get my parking permit? All of those different things that people need at the same time. And then on the right-hand side is the product how-to. It's the, okay, I've understood the selling process, but now let me apply that to the product, whether that's banking services or routers and switches or utilities, whatever it might be. So go beyond the functional skills and do consider, as I know many of you do, also the other aspects of doing the job that people need. And again, that's especially important for millennials. The other thing I think that's worth saying about millennials is they're really, really bad at certain things. And one of them is picking up the phone. Millennials almost seem to have a kind of an allergic reaction to telephones. And I don't really classify myself as a millennial since I'm slightly past the watershed on that one, but I think I've almost inherited some of that allergy to phones as well. So in sales training and the content, we always try to make sure that there is a great deal of practice and experience to get over that hurdle of picking up the phone, whether it's to a new prospect or to an existing account. The content also obviously has to reflect today's challenges, and I think Brexit is a challenge. It's a challenge emotionally for people, but in business clearly we're already starting to see the impact of Brexit, there will be, likely some form of economic slowdown. There's a lot of uncertainty about mobility of people and the future of Europe generally. So the need to sell into a very uncertain environment raises its own challenges, and I don't think that uncertainty is going to go away terribly soon. So we may come back into a position where people need to learn how to sell into a recession, but at the very least they're going to need to be able to mitigate risk and identify risk much more actively with clients than they were previously. I mentioned social media earlier. My inclusion of the LinkedIn symbol here may be an attempt at belated subliminal advertising around my view on Brexit, by the way. But the use of social media, particularly of things like LinkedIn, for identifying potential entry points into an organization, understanding who the stakeholders are, etc., is key and has to be a part of any modern selling curriculum. And I've added marketing in there purely because, as I've alluded to earlier when I was talking about product, I think the barriers between marketing and sales are rapidly eroding, and I think that's a good thing. So it's no good people product launching without training the sales team how to sell the new product, and it's no good for the salespeople to just entirely rely on marketing to generate leads for them. It's much more about marketing your own individual brand as well as the company brand. So generally, including a bit of marketing in a sales curriculum seems to be something that is sensible in today's environment. The other thing about content is bite-sizing, and I think most of you will have come across and no doubt already do a lot of this. The way we think about it is that there are general topics or courses, if you like, but each of those has in it a bunch of different modules that you can break down to an easily absorbable chunk, and I think that's driven to a large extent by the attention span issues that I talked about earlier. We actually use a deck of cards to show this, so the kind of suit is the course and the card is the module, and it's a way of allowing people to consume content in small pieces but understand how that fits into the bigger context as well. And obviously things like LCMSs, learning content management systems, can help to facilitate that kind of self-directed learning. And that's one form of adaptive content. So millennials not only appreciate bite-sized content but also content that adapts itself to them, and I think that adaptation can be at two levels. It can be macro, in other words, it helps you to understand where your weak points are and delivers the content to you that is appropriate for your strengths and weaknesses. And it can be micro adaptation, where in a simulation, let's say, the program tracks how well you're doing and adapts its level of difficulty to keep you in the zone, in flow. So it keeps it just hard enough that you're learning, but not so hard that you get lost and struggle. So we've done that for many years in simulations, and it's a very effective way of making sure that different people get the maximum amount out of essentially the same learning experience. At the macro level, this is a typical kind of roadmap that one would want to create, I think, for, let's say, a millennial induction program that might start with some kind of engagement session and assessment, and then have a number of modules with kind of gates that people need to go past to move on to the next module. And that personal assessment you can see at the top left is a key part of the adaptation process, because it's that allows you to start the process of saying, okay, I think you need to focus on the following 5 things, and we'll give you a kind of shortcut pass for the following 3. The last thing to say in terms of content is, we are looking at the YouTube generation, and I'm a photographer, and if I need to know something new about how to use Photoshop or take a low light photograph or whatever it might be, generally I don't go to a classroom. I go onto YouTube and I'll find somebody or a company that's put out a pretty good guide, and I can generally figure out the rest. So I think that's a fairly common mode of operation for people in the field, and it behooves us to allow people to create user-generated content, whether it's video or, I've uploaded a case study, or here's an example of a tool I filled out, or just my thoughts on a particular industry. I know many of the LMSs out there that people use allow that kind of user-generated content, but if you don't, or if nobody's using it, because the other issue is how do I encourage and motivate people to actually use that functionality, that is well worth looking at. So that's a few thoughts on content. Let me turn now to learning design. And I think in learning design, this is where a lot of the really interesting innovation is happening right now. I'm going to talk mostly about skill building, but I did want to just touch on one issue around knowledge transfer. And there are, I think the tools we use to build knowledge are necessarily a bit different from the ones to build skill. I really like this thing called Lightboards, which this is an example from, I think, Northwestern University. And essentially a lightboard is it's a kind of Perspex chalkboard that you pump full of light, and the video is done from the front but flipped over so that the presenter can write on this thing, but it appears the correct way around to the viewer. And as a way of kind of doing really quick but very, very kind of engaging videos, or indeed live kind of live work with people, especially in a flipped classroom kind of environment, which I'll talk a bit more about later. I think it's a very interesting tool. I think you can actually make these yourself for not too much money, so worth taking a look. Particularly, by the way, for kind of just-in-time training. So if you're doing a a quick download on a new competitive action or something like that, this can be quite powerful. But let me turn to the issue of skill building, which is where I want to focus most here. Most of you will have come across Kolb's learning cycle, which typically it is a cycle, but typically it begins with some kind of experience. So I put my finger into a candle flame and it hurts. There is a period of reflection where I'm trying to figure out what happened, and then a period of abstract conceptualization where I'm basically building a mental model of the world. So kind of flame hot, pain, not a good connection. And then finally experimentation, where I might kind of try putting my finger in different things and seeing how much it hurts. In a sales context, clearly it's about trying, maybe it could be a role play or a real play or an exercise, but that kind of process, and especially the reflection part and the experience part, is critical to learning. And it is why, in my view, most e-learning doesn't work for skill building, because often it focuses very much on the abstract conceptualization phase and doesn't really give enough experience or reflection. The experimentation part is often done through on-the-job types of activities, but the experience in e-learning is relatively lacking. I don't think a quiz really counts for that. So if you're trying to build genuine skills, and of course we are here, understanding that learning cycle and actually applying it, I think, is critical. Now, you can do that in good workshop design. So the experience could be an exercise, an application of a piece of theory, or sorry, let me come back to that, an application of people's gut feeling to a real-life situation. Could be a role play, could be an actor-based role play. We're big fans of real plays, where you actually engage with real customers there in the workshop, maybe calling them up to try and book appointments, or going online. The sleuthing thing is going online to find out about real customers at that point. Then you have the reflection piece, which most of us know and understand. So, debriefing the experience, debating what worked and what didn't, and it's worth saying the role of table coaches, I think, is very important there. So engaging managers in the learning experience, they're talking to people on the table and getting them into the process of encouraging that reflection, trains the managers how to do that later on back in the field. Then we have what we all generally know how to do quite well in training, which is theory push, theory pull, so Socratic learning, using videos and mini exercises to kind of establish the theory, and then maybe trying the exercise again, but this time with the benefit of that theory. Now, what I've just set out is actually subtly different from what happens in most training. Most training would start with the theory and then do an exercise. So I'm kind of advocating here a more experiential approach to the design of sales training. I think the other thing that is very important is emotion, because people remember, thanks to the way our brains work, and in particular the amygdala and its function in kind of forcing memory around highly emotive experiences, emotion tends to drive recall. So the more immersive you can make something and the more real you can make it feel, the more it's likely to genuinely affect behavior and skill after the workshop. So that's kind of my take on the best practice in workshop design. You can do that in e-learning as well, because you can use simulations to provide the experience and the experimentation piece. Simulations are can be role plays. You know, a standard role play is actually a good tool because it's a simulation of a conversation. What computer simulations allow you to do is to not only simulate the conversation but also extend it to other aspects of the kind of account strategy or the opportunity strategy. So putting together a pitch, you know, figuring out stakeholders, that kind of things are easier to do in a simulation than in a role play. And also by putting it into a computer sim, you can put it in the cloud and create something that's very, very scalable, which is quite nice. So here you do a simulation, you get feedback, and this is the kind of thing where you might be talking to an animated character on screen and you get given a number of different choices to make, and they kind of talk back to you. It's sort of a branching simulation that we tend to use, but rather than being a single tree with lots of branches, it's kind of a forest where you might have different trees that you can climb, if that makes sense. So you do the experience, you reflect with feedback on how people have done, you then give them some theory that might adapt itself to their strengths and weaknesses as shown in the simulation, and then finally you have another go with the sim, this time with the advantage of that theory, and then later on we get people to go out and try this in the field, so the on-the-job piece, but again I'll come back to that in a second. So simulations are effective. We found that virtual reality simulations are actually potentially even more effective because of the raw emotional power of feeling present with somebody in that kind of situation. VR is still relatively new, but it's come a long way in the last 6 months with things like the Vive and the Oculus Rift that are now available. Incredibly useful for things like presentation training. So, you know, if you have somebody who is nervous of public speaking, and I was doing a speech to a couple of thousand people a couple of months ago, and you know I do this a lot, but even I was nervous there. You can actually put somebody on a stage in virtual reality with their presentation in front of them on foldback monitors and have them present in that situation and really kind of overcome the fear of that sort of engagement. So VR is potentially, I think, very interesting in the future. A bit hard to scale right now because these things are expensive and need a big computer, but those are things that we are looking at. And I think it's worth pointing out as well, you know, real life is also quite powerful here. So Mercedes-Benz and Cisco have built combined classrooms that include labs or workshops, if you like, so you can learn about a feature of a car and then go and play with it. So that has driven up retention and pass rates quite a bit on their sales accreditation. So, you know, our new car has a great shopping holder which locks bags into place and stops your sprouts mixing around in the boot. It costs this and it's made of that. Let's go and have a play with it. So, you know, don't forget real life as a tool. The other thing that I think going outside the technology and into the kind of learning process, in karate people talk about Kata and Bunkai. So Kata is practicing a series of moves in a very stylized and formulaic way, and Bunkai is the application of that to essentially combat. And we have started thinking about that as quite a useful analogy for the way sales training can work. So if the kind of virtual training I've just talked about is the Kata, then the Bunkai is the application session where the manager or an external person kind of uses those skills and helps people to go that step towards application. So that's, I think, an emerging theme that we're going to see more of. But you can take it one step further, which is what I call back-to-front or learning, or in the States it's being talked about as flipped learning these days. So the way most training works is you train, you measure people on how well they've learned it and how they're applying it, and then you coach them to kind of make it stick. The back-to-front learning approach actually flips those two, so that you start off by coaching people. So we might go in and do a deal coaching process around, bring us an opportunity, let's do some really intense coaching around that opportunity, and in the process you kind of learn some of the skills through osmosis. We then measure how people have got that and do training just to kind of top up and make sure that people have understood the full range of things or tools or skills that they can bring to bear. The nice thing about that is it gives people an early payoff, because the deal coaching ends up with a genuine payoff at the end of it, and people get a flavour of what good looks like, so they really understand why they're learning something as well as what the content is. So flipping or back-to-front learning, I think, is a very interesting technique, and it's something that I would encourage you to try if you've not tried it yet. And I guess all of that, many of you will have heard of 70-20-10. Essentially 70% of learning is on the job, 20% learning from others, 10% formal learning. Sometimes this is used to say formal learning is bad, and that's not the point here. Formal learning is important, but it's just saying there is a huge ecosystem of learning that stretches above that like an iceberg, or an inverted iceberg, that one mustn't forget. So formal on-the-job activities, making sure coaching happens is important for on-the-job learning. Learning from others can be deal coaching, account clinics, trying to make sure that the social aspects of your LMS are being used effectively, knowledge sharing, and so on. What we tend to do is to try and create a roadmap for, and again, I'm not trying to pitch our particular approach here, but just rather to show the kinds of things that one can try and achieve, is to kind of create a mixed learning plan that embraces that 70-20-10 structure, so that on the left you've got kind of self-led, formal, manager-led and social learning, and we try and make sure that we flip people in between those different types of activity, both the manager and the salespeople, as they progress through a program, so that you're getting a really good balance between the 70, the 20 and the 10. So in the last section here I'd like to talk a little bit about the change process. I showed you this diagram earlier, and so this is really not just the learning design, but the wider change process that learning design sits in, and the way that innovation can help in that area as well. So I'll talk very, very quickly about each of the stages: connect, engage, develop, stick, and measure. Connect first. Connect is about kind of tuning into the way the organization's feeling about the change that you're proposing, to put it simply. And many of you will have used one or another form of stakeholder analysis. This is one I like, where we have influence on the left-hand axis and attitude for on the right, against on the left on the bottom. And you can sort of divide people into champions, supporters, opponents who are kind of weak opponents, and nemesis that are highly influential opponents. And you will have a different change strategy depending on where somebody sits on that 2x2 matrix. Now you can use technology to essentially kind of syndicate an idea, a vision for the change that needs to happen in the sales force, and get people to comment on it and to measure commitment using some form of net promoter score, and ultimately to plot, and you may choose not to do this by individual, but to plot the organization on this kind of a grid, so you can understand, how your change map looks, how many, or ideally who, the champions are that you can leverage to influence the others, the nemesis that you need to take action on, etc., etc. So using technology, not just thinking about the training piece, but about the change piece as well, is I think, a very powerful approach. In the engage stage, you're trying to get into the ideas of, kind of, or trying to excite people about the change that's to happen, and to understand what the baseline is. So using assessments is something that most organisations do already, whether it's psychometric or competency assessments, but tying that back into the learning journey and using that to, as we talked earlier, adapt the learning journey makes those assessments feel much more relevant to people as they approach the learning. It also, of course, allows you to measure ROI and to baseline any improvements that you're achieving. In the develop stage, we've talked about develop quite a bit, but the content that we create for a course and the course kind of lens or way in, if you like, is at the top there. So a course has a lot of content you build for it, and that might be a core program, it might be something that's proactive, so you're launching a new product or you're doing post-merger integration and you're trying to create a course in order to support that change, or it could be reactive, so a competitor may be taking some pricing action that you need to respond to. That's only one way into the content, and for me there are kind of two other primary ways to get at that content, and we should allow people to access the content in multiple ways. Different LMSs, different LCMSs allow this to a different degree. We kind of tend to talk about academy management systems that are geared up to do this kind of thing, but it's also about linking to the other tools that people use. So when you're looking at somebody doing a task, you want them to be able to access that content ideally from their CRM. So it could be context-led. So I'm in a tool that's looking at an account plan, and I can access the account planning learning that way. Or it could be analytics-led, as some organizations are doing. So people like Marketo and Eloqua, it's kind of the mix of CRM and marketing automation, but essentially it's throwing up, based on your pipeline, based on your velocity within the pipeline, here's some issues that you might want to look at. The task can also be done through the LMS. And of course, if you have separate tools, even frankly a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint tool, you can still embed a link to that learning component in that tool so that people are getting just-in-time task-focused help where they need it. The third lens, the third occasion, if you like, that we can talk about learning is based on competency. So this is not a course for the whole company, but this is the manager saying, look, you need to get better at questioning skills or about competitive positioning, so go and focus on that. And ideally people would have access to their own competency grid and be able to drill down and say, okay, today I want to look into this particular issue. So that's where the modular content, the bite-sized content really comes in, and the personalization is especially important. Empowering managers to coach. So one of the things we found is that managers are really bad at coaching, and they don't really like doing it. There are a few who do, but generally training managers to coach is not enough. You actually have to coach the coach to help them to get over the hurdle and get better at coaching. One nice thing that something like the Virtual Sales Academy can do, and we've done this with Cisco, is it can put a structure around that coaching. So at the end of each section for Cisco, the system sends an email to the manager and to the user. It gives them both a role-play scenario that's customized to their situation, and then they do the role-play, and the manager puts in their the competency scores directly into the system that feeds through to the user's competency readout. And what the feedback we've had is that basically gives the managers a real sense of empowerment around it, and it gives them, for the first time, a real controlled opportunity to coach the team member, and it makes the manager look much better in the eyes of the team member as well. So there's kind of a double payoff there. Another example that I quite like in terms of empowering managers to coach is Mitsubishi, who have a really interesting corporate mentoring program which uses the same technology as Match.com. When I was putting this together, I actually had Match.com open on my monitor, and we have an open plan office, so the fact that I'm married and my wife walked in and saw Match.com on my monitor probably didn't help me too much for later on. But this is why it was on there. So they actually use that technology, the kind of intelligent matching, to link senior leaders with expertise with people who are early in their career who need that expertise. And I think that's a really interesting kind of extension of the knowledge network approach. The stick phase of the kind of capability building, if you like, is also a very important one, I think. Now, most organizations and indeed most sales vendors, sales training vendors, have some kind of tool that sits in the CRM that drives uptake, and it can be as simple, frankly, as, again, spreadsheets or PowerPoint, or it can be, you know, a native plugin that sits inside your CRM, whichever CRM it is. I know that others and we are looking at how you also integrate the learning piece, so you're effectively tying together the LMS, the CRM, and the tools to create kind of an integrated ecosystem for the salespeople to learn and work in. The other approach to that is kind of sales playbooks, and there are a range of companies that are doing some very interesting stuff there. I quite like the Covidian sales playbooks. I think they're quite nicely put together. Playbooks are generally kind of around process support overall, but I think they become really interesting when they help you to apply that sales approach to specific products and services or selling scenarios. We have a thing called SEPT, which is sales-enabled product training, where we basically go, look, if you're launching a new product, the training for the product needs to reflect the sales methodology that you are training, so that it's all joined up. So that kind of playbook or SEPT style of thing can really help with the embedding of the skills. And then finally, let me just talk about measure. So most of you will know Kirkpatrick. I think it's very important to measure level 4 Kirkpatrick and the business impact of what we do. You can do that by looking at sort of control groups and data coming out of the CRM. We also find that attribution is a useful way of doing this. So getting people to attribute particular bits of what they've done in an account to the skills or the tools, perhaps with a panel to assess that and make sure that, you know, the manager is kind of encouraging the right behavior and that things aren't being put in that don't make sense. But the one thing I did want to pull out here on the top of this picture is the importance of measuring coaching as well as measuring the sales skills. Above all other skills, coaching is the one that we found responds well to being measured. So both quality and quantity of coaching, if that's being tracked, it's a really good way of driving that behavior. And as I said right at the beginning, millennials are extremely keen on coaching, so the more you can gear the managers up, the research I've seen shows that managers think they're giving coaching, but millennials don't think they are. So trying to bring those two sides together is really key. So that's kind of everything I wanted to talk about. Again, we've talked about content. For millennials, we've talked about different approaches to learning design, and then we've talked about the change process and how you can use technology and innovative approaches to empower both the connect, the engage, as well as the development itself, the stick phase, and the measurement. There is obviously a massive amount of content and a lot of people thinking hard about this topic. So obviously I'm limited in what I can really cover in 40-odd minutes. I would be genuinely happy to talk about this, to provide additional information, anything else that you guys would like. Again, I'm not trying to kind of pitch anything here, but just in case you're interested in drilling into some of the virtual stuff a bit more, we're just about to launch a new kind of sub-website on the Imparter Virtual Sales Academy, which is the email address at the top here. If you wanted to explore that kind of simulation-based academy management system, that might be an interesting place to go and have a look. But equally, I'm very happy to share links to other companies' work and other examples if you would like. So with that, thank you very much indeed. I hope that's been informative and useful, and I'd be very happy to take any questions at all.
Thank you, Richard. That was fantastic. Some great insight there. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions coming through. You've talked about virtual reality and distance learning as well, but do you feel there's a role for the classroom in the future of sales training?
I do. I mean, I think it's kind of we've been talking about blended learning for many years, but I think while distance learning and virtual training and so on is very effective for a number of things. So induction is great because you can do it before people join. If you have a dispersed sales force geographically, it's really fantastic. If you have other groups of people who you can't afford to put through a classroom-based session, so for example, sales engineers or sales ops people, the virtual academy type of approach can be very, very effective there. Do I think that workshops are ultimately the most effective way? I think if you'd asked me that question probably 2 years ago, or even 3 years ago, I would have said, yeah, I do. I think that is changing, and I think the virtual approaches are getting pretty close to being able to replicate what you can do in a workshop. However, I think the approach that's really kind of going to take off is the Kata Bunkai thing I was saying, where the workshop, you do the core stuff online, and the workshop is used really for the application stage, rather than to do the stuff that could more effectively be done online. And I think in the past, online has been knowledge transfer. Now, with simulations, you can actually get proper skill building online. You've got even more scope to use the classroom for, the more subtle bits of interpersonal skill and application.
Fabulous. Thanks, Richard. One more question. Bear with me. What would be your best advice to start measuring coaching skills in the sales manager community?
So I mentioned, that's a great question, actually. I mentioned the 2 dimensions of quality and quantity. I think if you're going to measure coaching, it sort of has to be a 180-degree thing. But so we've used 180 surveys before, and that can be built into the LMS, or you can even use kind of a SurveyMonkey type thing. The other thing we've done is allowed people to update competencies online. In our platform, you can go in and update something, and you can put comments and kind of justify a change in score, if you like, from one competency level to another. And by tracking that, you can actually measure the quantity of coaching. At the same time, we've looked at doing a sample of looking at the kind of coaching forms that people submit and assessing those for quality. So I guess the answer is there's a range of things going from simply capturing quantity through to quantity and an assessment of quality. And if you're doing coach the coach, the coach of the coach can give input on the quality as well. And then finally you can go up to a kind of a 180-degree where you're actually regularly getting an assessment from the manager and the salesperson or the account manager on the quality of coaching. The one thing I'd add to that very quickly is that tends to capture formal coaching occasions, and for my money, the kind of coaching that really has the biggest impact is actually just the kind of the quick, grow structured conversation around the water cooler. I think that's hard to capture unless you're really doing the 180. And if you formulate questions for a 180, make sure you formulate them in a way that allows people to talk about informal coaching as well as formal coaching.
Fabulous. Thank you, Richard. Another question very quickly. Who does the VR presentation scenario that you mentioned?
It doesn't exist yet. We're actually experimenting and building it right now. There are you can sort of do it. So with the HTC Vive, there's a I forget what it's called actually. I can find out and send it to you though to send around. But there's a bit of the VR, the Steam VR package that allows you to kind of create an environment. And basically, one of the environments that's been pre-built is it's a kind of but essentially a cinema rather than a kind of presentation with a stage, but it looks very much like a large auditorium. So it's kind of already there. If what we're trying to build in is the ability to kind of project your PowerPoint slides inside that environment and to kind of put an audience in it. But sorry, we seem to have a fire alarm test going on in the background. That's not good timing. But yeah, so it doesn't exist yet, to my knowledge, but it's one of several things that we're thinking about within VR, including actually taking our simulations that are currently kind of 2D, although they're in Unity, so they're a 3D based package, and putting you inside the simulation. And the tests we've done so far, again, suggest that that's quite a kind of visceral experience to go through.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. I'm really conscious of time, so thank you very, very much. We'd like to extend our thanks to you, Richard, for presenting that to us this morning. It's been extremely useful and a lot of insight there around millennials and approaches to that generation in terms of sales training. Just to let everyone know, we have been recording the session, and that will be available on the members resource area on the ISMM website by tomorrow morning, so do look out for that. You can contact Richard on his details that are shown on the screen. Our next webinar will be on the 30th of June, which will be around how to use LinkedIn to win business. And I'd just like to thank everyone for their attendance and their attention, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.